She called him Mr. Seven because he never gave his name. For 11 days she talked to him, argued with him, laughed near him, and stayed when everyone else walked away. She had no idea that his name was carved into every wall of that hospital, that every hallway she had ever walked down, every paycheck she had ever received, every dream she had built inside those walls belonged to him. This is not a story about power. It's a story about what happens when a man who has everything meets the one woman who treated him like he had nothing, and somehow that was the only thing he ever wanted. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. The night shift always smelled the same. Antiseptic, cold floor wax, the faint trace of coffee burned too long in the break room pot. Mary had memorized every note of it over 4 years of overnight rotations at Chicago General. She was 24 years old and already moved through those corridors like someone twice her age. Not slow, efficient, purposeful. Her sneakers barely made a sound against the linoleum as she pushed her medication cart past room 3, past room 5, and stopped in front of the door that had been making everyone on the floor uneasy for the past 18 hours. Room 7. She stood there a moment, chart in hand, reading what little had been written. Patient, John Doe. Admittance, emergency. Attending, Dr. Harlan. Status, stable. Additional notes, restricted access, administration clearance required. She read the last line twice. Restricted access. In 4 years, she had never once seen that written on a chart. She turned the page, blank, turned it again, blank. The entire second half of the intake form was empty, as if whoever had filled it out had stopped mid-sentence and decided the rest was no one's business. She knocked twice and pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the soft blue glow of the monitors beside the bed. The man lying there was still, not the restless still of someone sleeping lightly, but the deep, anchored stillness of someone who had made a decision to be unconscious. Dark hair, a jaw that even in repose looked like it was holding something back. His hands rested outside the blanket, large, the knuckles of the right one slightly swollen. Hands that told stories their owner never would. There was a bandage across his left side, partially visible beneath the hospital gown. GSW. She had seen enough of them to recognize the shape of the dressing. She checked the IV line, checked the monitor, wrote her initials on the observation sheet and lingered longer than protocol required. Who are you? Not with suspicion, with something quieter. Curiosity that lived in the chest rather than the mind. I don't know if you can hear me, she said, her voice low. The habit of talking to unconscious patients so deeply ingrained, she didn't think about it anymore. But your vitals look good. Your body's doing the work. She adjusted the blanket an inch. You did a number on yourself, Mr. Whoever you are. She glanced at the chart. John Doe. John Doe, she repeated, and something about the generic blandness of it bothered her. It felt like a costume, like someone had dressed this man in the most invisible name possible and hoped no one would look too closely. She looked closely. I'm going to call you Mr. Seven, she said, mostly to herself, capping her pen. Since that's what the door says. She turned to go. Behind her, the heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, and then, so subtle she almost missed it, the beeping slowed. Just slightly. Steadied. As if something in the room had shifted toward calm. Mary paused at the door, her hand on the frame. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself that for 11 days. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of small urgencies. Mrs. Patterson in room 3 needed her pain meds adjusted. The new intern had charted a dosage wrong, and Mary caught it before it reached the pharmacy. Room 11 had a call button malfunction. Room 9 had a visitor who had stayed past hours and needed gentle but firm redirecting toward the elevator. Through all of it, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to carry exhaustion like a second skin, wearing it without letting it slow her down. By 3 a.m. the floor had quieted to its nighttime murmur. She refilled her coffee, stood at the window at the end of the hall, and looked out at the city. Chicago in winter was brutal and luminous at the same time, the lakefront wind pressing against the glass, while the skyline held its ground against the dark. She had grown up 12 blocks from this hospital, had applied here not because it was the best option, she'd had others, but because something in her had never wanted to go too far. Her mother had been a patient here once, and then again. And then a third time, the last time, and Mary had been 17, and had sat in a waiting room 2 floors down and decided, with the clarity that only grief produces, that she wanted to be on the other side of that door. She wanted to be the one who knew things, who could do something. 4 years later she was, and it was enough. She was still at the window when she heard it, barely audible, a voice from room 7. She was down the hall before she had consciously decided to move. She pushed the door open slowly. The monitors were steady, but the man had turned his head toward the door. His eyes were open, alert in a way that did not match someone who had been unconscious for 18 hours. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they have been waiting for. Mary stood very still. "Hey," she said carefully, "welcome back." He said nothing, just watched her. "Do you know where you are?" She stepped inside, reaching for the pen light at her breast pocket. "Can you tell me your name?" A long pause. "Why are you the one who stayed?" Not where am I, not what happened, not the confusion and panic she had been trained to manage. Why are you the one who stayed? The words landed in the center of her chest and stayed there. "Because it's my job," she said. He held her gaze. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. "Is that the only reason?" he asked. Mary clicked the pen light on and stepped forward. "Mr. 7, she said firmly, "follow the light." He did. Pupils equal, reactive, cognition intact. She made her notes. She kept her breathing even. And when she left the room 10 minutes later, she stood in the corridor with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, waiting for the feeling in her chest to settle back into something she recognized. It didn't. By the next morning, the rules had arrived. Not written down, not delivered in a memo. That was the thing about certain kinds of power. It didn't need to announce itself. It moved through a building the way cold air moves through a cracked window, without ceremony, without explanation, and impossible to ignore once you felt it. Mary noticed it first in the way her supervisor, Janet Okafor, looked at her when she handed over the shift report. Janet was a woman who had run the third-floor nursing staff for 11 years, with the calm authority of someone who had seen everything. She was not easily rattled. But when Mary mentioned room 7, the patient's cognition, his responsive pupils, the fact that he was awake and would need a revised care plan, Janet's expression did something quiet and significant. She didn't write it down. "I'll pass it to Dr. Harlan," Janet said, capping her pen. "I can update the chart myself," Mary offered. "I'll pass it to Dr. Harlan," Janet said again. Same tone. The conversation was closed. Mary walked to her locker, changed her shoes, stood in the break room with her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Restricted access, administration clearance required. She thought about those words the entire drive home. She slept 4 hours and came back for the evening shift, with the heightened awareness that poor sleep sometimes produced, sharp edges, small things coming in clear. She noticed that the charge nurse on the afternoon shift had not entered room 7 once in 6 hours. She checked the observation log, 2 sets of initials, both belonging to a senior nurse named Paul, who, when Mary passed him in the hallway, met her eyes and looked away first. She noticed 2 men she didn't recognize standing near the elevator bank. Not patients, not visitors. They had the quiet, still posture of people paid to watch things. And she noticed, inconveniently, the pull she felt toward room 7 that had nothing to do with obligation. She went in at 7 p.m. with her cart, her chart and her professional composure, layered carefully over everything else. He was awake, moved to a semi-reclined position, which made the room feel somehow smaller. He watched her come in with that focused, unhurried attention she was already cataloguing as simply how he looked at things. "You came back," he said. "I work here," Mary said. She set the chart on the side table. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. Scale of 1 to 10. 3. She didn't believe him. The tension around his eyes said 4, maybe 5, but she had learned not to argue with a number that didn't indicate crisis. "I'm going to check your dressing," she said. She moved to his left side. The room was quiet. She worked efficiently, her movements practiced and sure, keeping her eyes on her hands because looking at his face from this distance felt like something she needed to not do. "You didn't answer my question," he said. "Which one?" "Last night. Whether the job was the only reason." Mary resecured the dressing. "That's not a medically relevant question." "No," he agreed, "it's not." She stepped back, made her note. "You need to eat. Is there anything you're—" "What's your name?" She looked up. He was watching her with that unreadable patience, and something about the directness of it made her answer before she decided to. Mary. He held it for a moment, like a word he was placing carefully in his memory. Mary, he repeated. Just that, her name in his voice, low and deliberate, and she felt it move through her like a current she had no framework for. And yours? She asked. The pause was long, a choice, not a hesitation. Does it matter? He said finally. It matters for the chart. The chart has a name. The chart has John Doe, she said, keeping her voice level, which we both know isn't real. Something changed in his expression, almost like approval, like she had passed a test without knowing she was being evaluated. Get some rest, Mr. Seven, she said, and picked up the chart. You're going to keep calling me that. Until you give me something better. She was at the door when his voice came quietly behind her. Come back at 10. Not a request, not a command. Something in between. Words that assumed a particular outcome without demanding it. Mary did not respond. She came back at 10. They didn't talk about names again that night. They talked about the city. She had mentioned the view from the end of the hall offhand, and he had asked about it with the interest of someone who had not looked out a window in some time. She told him about the lakefront in winter, the way the wind came off the water with a personal quality, like it had an opinion about you. He listened the way very few people listened, without preparing his next sentence, without waiting for her to finish so he could speak. Just listening, his dark eyes on her face, and she found herself saying more than she'd intended, and then stopping, aware of it. You're good at that, she said. At what? Making people talk. A slow breath through his nose. I'm just paying attention. Most people don't. Most people have too much noise in their own heads, he said. Mary looked at him. Do you? He looked at the ceiling, at the pale acoustic tiles. When he answered, his voice had something new in it. Wait. Yes, he said, usually. But not right now. The pause that followed was the longest of the night. Not right now. Mary picked up her chart and stood, the professional gesture of leaving. I'll be back in the morning, she said. He didn't say goodnight, just watched her go. And the heart monitor, steady and blue in the dark room, kept its quiet, even rhythm, the same rhythm it held only when she was there. She was halfway down the corridor when her colleague Dana fell into step beside her, coffee in hand, eyebrows slightly raised. How's the mystery man? Stable, Mary said. You've been in there 20 minutes. Dressing check took longer than expected. Dana looked at her sideways. The dressing. The dressing. Dana sipped her coffee. Okay, she said, filing it away for later. The dressing. Mary kept walking. She kept her face perfectly neutral. And the night shift continued. It started with a form. A standard medication reconciliation form, the kind Mary completed a dozen times per shift. Routine to the point of invisibility. The kind of task the hands complete while the mind is somewhere else entirely. On the fourth day, her mind was mostly somewhere else. She was at the nurse's station at 11 p.m. when she pulled up room 7's file on the terminal and found nothing. Not the restricted notice from before. Not even a placeholder. The room number was there, the admittance date was there, but every field that should have contained patient information was blank, scrubbed clean the way a whiteboard looks after someone has gone over it twice. Mary stared at the screen. She followed the admittance reference number to the pharmacy records. The medication orders existed, prescribed, fulfilled. She followed the prescription ID to the attending physician's account and hit a wall. Access restricted. Contact administration. She sat back in her chair. In 4 years, she had followed paper trails that always led somewhere. This one led to a door with no handle. She closed the terminal. Then she went to room 7. He was awake, as he almost always was when she came in late. Your records have been deleted, she said. No preamble. She had decided walking down the corridor that she was done approaching this room with careful indirection. He looked at her. Have they? Not a question, a confirmation. Every patient file in this hospital is backed up to 3 servers, she said. Yours doesn't exist in any of them. Someone inside this building removed it. That doesn't happen accidentally. No, he agreed, it doesn't. Who are you? She asked it directly without softening. The silence stretched. Outside, a door closed softly down the hall. The monitors hummed. I told you my name doesn't matter, he said. You've told me a lot of things that haven't answered my question. She crossed her arms, organized, not defensive. There are men by the elevator who aren't hospital staff. Your records have been erased. My supervisor won't let anyone else enter this room. And you... Her voice shifted just slightly from interrogation to something more human. You're the most awake person I've ever seen in a hospital bed. You're not recovering. You're waiting. He looked at her for a long moment. Close the door, Mary. She did. She turned back to face him, standing at the foot of the bed, and waited. He exhaled slowly. It was the first time she had seen him hesitate. I'll tell you what I can, he said, which isn't everything. Tell me what's true, I'll decide if it's enough. That not quite smile again, deeper this time, like she had surprised him. I own things, he said, companies, properties. A pause. Institutions. Mary waited. Institutions, he said, like hospitals. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Mary did not move. She held the information carefully, aware of its temperature, testing where it burned. This hospital, she said. He held her gaze and said nothing, which was its own answer. Mary breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. She thought about 4 years, the underfunded supply closets that had quietly resolved 18 months ago, new equipment that appeared without announcement, a building annex that broke ground last spring with a funding source listed only as private donor. She had been grateful for those things, had not thought to ask where they came from. Now she stood in the room where the answer had been sleeping. You own the hospital, she said. Yes. And you came here, your own hospital, without telling anyone who you were. I came because I needed to understand how this place runs, he said, whether the people responsible for protecting it were doing the opposite. Were they? Yes. She looked at him for a long time, the man with the gunshot wound and the empty chart, and she tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what she now knew. He didn't look like ownership. He didn't look like the arrogance she associated with people who had too much of both. He looked like a man who was deeply tired and refusing to show it. Why are you telling me? She asked. Because you asked directly, he said. And because you're the only person in this building who has treated me like a patient instead of a problem to be managed. The honesty of it, the weight and simplicity of it, changed the air in the room. Mary said nothing for a moment. I need you to understand, she said, keeping her voice level, that what I do in this room is my job. My professionalism doesn't change based on who you turn out to be. I know, he said, but who you turn out to be does change things for me, personally. He held her gaze. I know that too. She picked up the chart that didn't contain his real name. Get some sleep, she said, real sleep. Your body needs it even if you don't think it does. She was at the door when something on the side table caught her eye, a folded piece of paper, half tucked under the water glass, thick, cream-colored stationery. No letterhead. She picked it up, unfolded it. A purchasing agreement. Several pages, dense with legal language. She skimmed it fast. Date 3 months ago. She went to the last page. A signature. Clean, controlled, without excess. William Ashford. She stood there with the paper in her hands and the name settling over her, like the first cold of a season change, sudden and total and impossible to unfeel. She looked up. He was watching her. He had been watching her the moment she picked it up. He had wanted her to see it. William, she said quietly, testing the name against the man. He said nothing. But his eyes, for the first time since she had walked into this room 4 days ago, showed her something unguarded. Something that looked unmistakably like relief. Like a name finally in the right mouth. She didn't come back that night. William lay in the dark of room 7 and noted her absence the way he noted most things, precisely without commentary. He had pushed it too far with the document. He knew that. Showing the truth instead of saying it plainly was the kind of control he defaulted to without thinking, let the other person arrive at the conclusion themselves. But Mary was not the kind of person who liked to be led somewhere, even gently. He had understood that within the first 20 minutes of knowing her, and he had done it anyway. The room felt extraordinarily large without her in it. He was still thinking about it when the door opened at 6:47 a.m. Mary had gone home, slept 3 hours, the shallow kind where the mind keeps processing even when the body has stopped, and come back 2 hours before her shift started. She had decided, somewhere between waking and rising, that she was not going to let herself be managed by her own reaction. She had been surprised. She was no longer surprised. She had things to say. She closed the door behind her. William looked at her with that watchful steadiness, and she stood at the side of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying before she spoke. "You knew who I was," she said, "before you woke up." "Yes." The honesty, the absence of deflection, did not soften her. She had expected denial, or at least hedging. The straightforwardness was harder to be angry at, and so she was briefly angrier because of it. "How?" "Staff reports. I review personnel files of key employees in all facilities I own. Yours was flagged 3 months ago by an internal compliance review." He held her gaze. "You reported a billing irregularity, a significant one. Nobody above you acted on it." "I know nobody acted on it. I submitted the report twice." "I know. It was buried by the hospital's financial director." Something in his voice went flat. "That's what I was here to investigate." "You were investigating your own hospital. Corruption in a facility I own is still corruption. The fact that it's mine makes it worse, not better." She looked at him, at the stillness of him, the hands resting on the blanket. "You should have told me from the beginning," she said. "I couldn't. Couldn't or calculated that you shouldn't." The pause answered for him. "Both," he said. "If my presence here became known, the people I was investigating would have covered faster. I needed more time. And so you let me care for you, not knowing who—" "You cared for me the same way, regardless," he said. The quiet certainty in his voice stopped her. "That's not something I arranged, Mary. That's just who you are." She stood there with the morning light beginning at the window and 4 days pressing against the back of her chest. "I'm angry," she said, plainly, like stating a temperature. "I know. I don't like being managed." "I know that too." "Then why?" "Because I didn't know another way to be honest with you." The admission was stripped of armor, unlike every other thing he had said in this room. "I'm not good at straightforward. I've spent a long time in rooms where honesty was a liability. The document," he paused, "was the closest I knew how to get." Outside, somewhere in the corridor, a cart rolled past and someone laughed. The brief, bright sound of a hospital morning beginning. Mary sat down in the chair beside his bed. Not close, just down, the deliberate settling of a woman who had decided to stay. "Tell me about the corruption," she said. "All of it." He studied her. The shift from anger to this, the practical, forward-moving clarity she returned to like a compass, returns to north. "The financial director has been redirecting funds," he said, "overcharging Medicare, underreporting to the board. The diverted money flows through a shell company to a private equity group building a case to force a buyout at undervalued price." He paused. "If that goes through, this hospital stops being a community facility. It becomes a private care center. The people in this neighborhood would lose their hospital," Mary finished. "Yes." She was quiet, thinking. "The billing irregularity I reported," she said, "that was part of it. It was the first piece of the paper trail. And nobody acted on it because the financial director killed it." "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap, then up at him. "So my report matters," she said. "Your report was what confirmed to me that someone on this floor was paying attention." His voice was careful. "You were the reason I decided to come in person instead of sending an investigator." Mary looked at him sharply. "What?" "I needed to understand the scope of the internal access. The only way to do that undetected was to be inside, unidentified. I chose the 3rd floor because your report came from the 3rd floor." She sat very still with that. With the weight of discovering that the choices which had led her here, the report filed twice into what felt like a void, the anger of being ignored, the determination to keep working while swallowing the futility of it, had not gone into the void at all, had been received, had led somewhere, had led to him in this room calling her the reason. "That doesn't make me feel better about being misled," she said finally. "I know," and then quietly, "I'm sorry, Mary." She believed him. Not because of the words, but because of what they cost him. The slight recalibration around his eyes, the give in the set of his jaw. Apology was not native to him. He was choosing it in real time, for her. She stood, smoothed her scrubs, picked up the chart. "I'm still angry," she said. "You're allowed to be. And I still think you should have told me earlier. You're right." She looked at him one more time. At William Ashford in a hospital bed in his own hospital, watching her with something in his eyes that was not asking and not commanding and not either of the things she had a word for. "Get some rest," she said. "I'll come back at noon with the updated care plan." She was at the door. "Mary." She turned. He held her gaze across the room. In the growing morning light, his face was very clear. The exhaustion in it, the control, and underneath both, something newer and less managed. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back." She said nothing. She walked out into the corridor and let the door close softly behind her. And she stood there for exactly 4 seconds, eyes closed, breathing. Then she went to work. On the 7th day, the power went out. Not the whole building. Chicago General had backup generators that kicked in for critical equipment within 40 seconds. But the primary grid failed at 11:23 p.m. on a Wednesday, and in those 40 seconds, the 3rd floor went dark. In 40 seconds, a great deal can happen. Mary was at the medication cart at the far end of the corridor when the lights cut. She heard the collective inhale of the floor, that instinctive human sound of people in a place where darkness has consequences, and she was already moving before her eyes had adjusted, navigating by memory and the faint green of the emergency exit signs as the backup lights stuttered to life. "Okay," she said, loud enough to carry, hitting the frequency that communicated both calm and urgency. "Everyone stay in position. Backup power in 30 seconds. Call out if you have a critical alert." The generator caught. The backup lights, dimmer, amber-toned, held. "Vitals," she called. "Room 3 stable." Dana's voice came from the left. "Room 5 stable," from the right. "Room 9, call button down, patient agitated." The new intern, voice tight. "I'll go," Mary said. "Dana, check room 11. Paul." She turned and Paul was already there, flashlight in hand. "Run a floor check. Start from room 1. "On it." She moved to room 9, managing the patient's anxiety with the combination of presence and calm explanation that worked better than any sedative. She rerouted his call light to the backup system, updated his chart, and was back in the corridor in 7 minutes. She did all of this with the automatic competence of muscle memory. And in a separate, simultaneous part of her mind, she was aware at all times of room 7. The door was closed, as always. No sound from inside. The 2 men who normally stationed themselves near the elevator were gone. The darkness had shifted the geometry of their surveillance. She went to room 7 on her way back to the station. He was sitting up in bed, fully alert, his phone in his hand. The first time she had seen him with a phone in 7 days. The sight of it struck her strangely. The reminder that he had a life beyond this room. Connections, resources. A phone that had presumably been ringing for a week. "All good?" she said from the doorway. "All good," he said. He lowered the phone. "You handled that well. It's a power outage. You had the entire floor stabilized before the backup fully engaged." No flattery in his tone, just a fact he had noted. "Most people lose 30 seconds to panic. Panicking doesn't help my patients." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He looked at her across the room in the amber light, and the quality of the light changed his face somehow, made it more visible, the way candlelight does. That's not something you can teach someone. Either they have it or they don't. Mary stood in the doorway and felt something she had been carefully not feeling for 7 days press against the inside of her chest with increased insistence. "I should check the rest of the floor," she said. "Of course." She didn't move immediately. Neither did he. The backup lights hummed. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. A door opened and closed somewhere in the building. "William," she said. His real name, the one she'd only been using internally. And it came out differently spoken aloud. More weight, more reality. He looked at her steadily. "Nothing," she said. "I'll come back." She went back to the floor. It was 2 hours later, at 1:30 a.m., when Dana found her in the break room. Mary was sitting at the small table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at a fixed point on the opposite wall. Dana sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment. "Okay," Dana said, "I'm going to say a thing." "Don't." "I'm going to." "Dana, you've checked room 7 9 times in the last 7 days, not counting medication runs. 9 times you've walked down that hall for no charted reason." Her voice was gentle, not accusatory. "He asks the night staff for you by name. He won't let the afternoon nurses change his dressing. He's perfectly civil to everyone else, but he waits. I've watched him, Mayor. And when you come on shift, the monitors do something I can't explain." Mary rotated the cold teacup. "He's a patient," she said. "Yes, he is," Dana said. "He's also whoever he is. Because Paul told me that Janet got a call this morning from the hospital's executive board about room 7. The board, Mary. Silence. I'm not going to tell you what to feel, Dana said, her voice quiet now. I'm just saying whatever is happening in that room is already more than a medication rotation, and I think you know that. Mary looked at her friend across the small table. It can't be anything, she said. Why not? She thought about the contract with his name on it, about the corridors she had walked for 4 years, about the distance between a 24-year-old night shift nurse and the man who owned the ground she stood on. Because it can't, she said. Dana was quiet for a moment. That's a fear dressed up as a reason, she said finally. Mary drank her cold tea. She didn't argue. At 3 a.m. she found the note. She had gone to room 7 to update the final observation log of her shift. He was asleep, genuinely asleep finally, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him. The control set aside, just a man breathing slowly in the dark. On the side table under the water glass, there was a folded piece of paper. Not a document this time, something smaller. She almost didn't take it. She took it. In the corridor light, she unfolded it. A single paragraph, handwritten. The board of this hospital has been informed that an internal investigation is concluding. The financial director will be removed by end of week. The evidence that initiated the investigation was a compliance report submitted by a staff nurse on the 3rd floor, submitted twice, ignored twice, and received by me on the 3rd transmission. The report will be formally credited in the investigation's final record. Her name will be on it. I want her to know that. No signature. Mary stood in the corridor at 3 a.m. with the paper in her hands and felt something large and quiet move through her. Gratitude, and something more complicated than gratitude. Something that lived in the space between professional and personal and refused to stay on either side. Her name will be on it. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket. She went back to room 7. He was still asleep. She sat in the chair beside his bed, the chair that had over 7 days become in some indefinable way her chair, and looked at him in the darkness, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the quiet didn't already contain. She left before he woke, but she left the chair angled toward him. And she did not move it back. He was gone on the 11th day. Not dramatically, not with the charged departure. That part of her, the part she had been managing with dedicated effort, had been half preparing for. No conversation, no forewarning. She came onto her shift at 7 p.m., and the corridor outside room 7 was simply different. The 2 men by the elevator were gone. The atmospheric pressure that had gathered around that door for 11 days had lifted. The door itself stood open, the way a door stands open when there is nothing behind it to keep private. She stood in the doorway. The room was orderly, bed made with tight hospital precision, side table cleared, monitor dark. The chair was still angled. She noticed that first, angled toward the bed the way she had left it 5 nights ago, and housekeeping had cleaned around it rather than straightening it. That small thing, the chair, held in place, not corrected, compressed something in her chest into a very tight, very bright point. On the pillow, an envelope. White. Her name on the front in that handwriting she now knew. She stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time. Then she walked in, picked up the envelope and put it in her pocket without opening it. She finished her shift. She opened it at 4 a.m., sitting in her car in the parking garage, engine off, interior dark. She took the envelope out, turned it over. The flap was sealed with the pressure of a hand. Prest closed himself. Something about that small physical detail felt more intimate than it should have. She opened it. Inside, a card, thick cream-colored, no letterhead. The investigation is concluded. The evidence is secured. The people who needed to be removed are being removed. You are safe here, safer than you were a month ago, though you didn't know it wasn't safe. I owe you an explanation I don't entirely know how to give, so I'll give you the part I'm sure of. I came to this hospital expecting to find a problem. I found one. I also found something I wasn't expecting and didn't prepare for, and don't have clean language for. I've been trying to find the language for 11 days. I haven't found it yet. Your report has been formally credited. Your name is in the record, I made sure of it. There's a phone number at the bottom of this card. It's my direct line, only 5 people have it. You can call it. You don't have to. Tab you may. Mary sat in her car for a long time. The city made its quiet nighttime sounds, a distant siren, a cab horn. the wind off the lake pressing against everything. She read the card twice. Then she sat with it and felt the full weight of what 11 days had built. Something without a name, like he'd said. Something that had grown between two people who had been, for reasons neither of them had chosen, entirely honest with each other. She put the card back in the envelope. Put the envelope in her bag. Drove home. He had not said goodbye. That was what she kept returning to in the days that followed. He had left a letter, a phone number, the chair held in its angle. But he had not said goodbye to her face, and she didn't know whether to interpret that as cowardice or its opposite. The third floor went back to its rhythms. Room 7 was occupied by a 70-year-old man named Gerald, who had a hip replacement and told very long stories about his years coaching high school football. Mary liked Gerald. Gerald was uncomplicated. She did not linger in Room 7's doorway. She did not think about the monitor's rhythm. She told herself this consistently, and on most hours of most days it was mostly true. On the 5th day, Dana stopped her in the corridor and said with careful gentleness, "You're doing that thing." "What thing?" "The I'm completely fine face. You've been wearing it for 5 days." "I am completely fine." "I know," Dana said. "That's the face." Mary walked away. She did not look at the phone number until the 7th day. She had left it on the card in the envelope in her bag, on the principle that information you have not moved is information you have not yet decided to use. On the 7th day, she took the card out during a lunch break and looked at the number. 10 digits, giving nothing away. She put it back. She put it back 4 more times over the following 3 days. On the 10th day after he left, she was standing at the window at the end of the corridor at 3 a.m., the window with the city view she had told him about, and her phone was in her hand, and she was looking at the skyline with the lakefront wind pressing against the glass. She did not call. She told herself it was because she was at work. She told herself it was because it was 3 a.m. She told herself a number of things, efficiently in sequence. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. It vibrated again. She answered. Silence. The non-empty silence of a line someone is on but hasn't spoken yet. Then, "You're at the window." Not a question. Mary looked out at the city, at the dark, at the lights, at the winter pressing in. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because it's 3 a.m., he said, "and you told me once that you go to the window when you can't settle." She had said that 11 days ago in the dark in the chair beside his bed. "William," she said. "Mary." "You didn't say goodbye," she said. A pause, longer than usual. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Why?" "Play breath, a decision being made." "Because I wasn't sure I could," he said. Mary stood at the window with Chicago outside, and the phone against her ear, and said nothing for a moment, because there was too much to say, which arrived as silence. "You left the chair," she said finally. "A beat." "I noticed you'd moved it," he said softly. "Housekeeping didn't correct it. I asked them not to." She closed her eyes for a moment. The lights of the city pressed against the back of her eyelids. "What do you want, William?" she asked. "I want to see you," he said. "Not in a hospital room, not because you're working. I want to see you as a person, if you're willing." Mary opened her eyes. The city was still there. Everything was exactly what it was. "I have Sunday off," she said. A pause, then quiet. "I know." She laughed, short, involuntary, startled out of her. "You know my schedule." "I own the hospital," he said simply. "That's extremely overstepping," he agreed. "I know." She shook her head at the dark glass. "Sunday," she said, not a question anymore. "Sunday," he confirmed. She ended the call. She stood at the window a little longer with her phone in her hand, and something in her chest that was not quite settled and not quite unsettled, almost like anticipation. The quiet electricity of a door opening rather than closing. She went back to work. And the night shift, for the first time in 10 days, felt like something she was moving toward rather than through. The address he sent was not what she expected. She had prepared herself, in the private way of someone trying to preempt a feeling, for something that would emphasize the distance between them. A restaurant she had never been able to afford. A building with a lobby designed to make her conscious of her coat. Something that would clarify before they even sat down how far apart they stood. What he sent was an address in Lincoln Square, walkable, unpretentious. The kind of Chicago block that still had a hardware store and a used bookshop and a coffee place without a minimalist logo. A third-floor apartment above a music school. She stood outside on Sunday morning and looked up at the building and thought, he chose this deliberately. She hadn't decided yet whether that made things easier or harder. He opened the door before she knocked. He looked different without the hospital gown and the monitor wires and the context of her authority over his care. Dark jeans, a simple grey sweater, no tie. No indication of the man who had signed his name to a purchasing agreement worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. He looked like a person, which was, she realized, precisely the point. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They stood in the doorway for a moment, and something in the air between them was different from every interaction they'd had in room 7, lighter somehow, and heavier at the same time. In the hospital, she had known her role. She had known where to stand. Here there was no role, and the freedom of that was indistinguishable from its exposure. He stepped back, she came in. The apartment was small and strangely personal. Books on a shelf, not displayed, read, spines creased, some with slips of paper marking pages. A kitchen that smelled of recently made coffee. A window overlooking the street where winter light came in flat and clean and honest. No artwork on the walls, no indication of wealth except in the quality of the silence. The quiet of good insulation and thick windows, and a building maintained by someone who cared about it. "You made coffee," she said. "I didn't know how you took it," he said, "so I didn't prepare it, I just made it." She looked at him. "That's a distinction." "It matters. Preparing something assumes you know someone. I don't know you yet." "Yet?" The word was small, it landed precisely. "Black," she said, "1 sugar." Something in his face shifted. Not a smile, but the movement toward one. He went to the kitchen and she looked at the books on the shelf. History mostly. Some economics. A novel with the cover worn down to almost nothing. Middlemarch, the binding repaired with tape at the spine. "You've read this more than once," she said. 4 times, he said from the kitchen. "Why?" A pause. The sound of a spoon against ceramic. "Because Dorothea Brooke keeps choosing wrong," he said, "and it keeps feeling like the most human thing I've ever read." Mary put the book back carefully. He came back with 2 cups, handed hers without ceremony. They stood on either side of the small coffee table, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had spent 11 nights in a dim room learning each other's rhythms, discovering those rhythms had followed them outside. "Sit down," he said, an offering. They sat. The winter light moved across the floor. The coffee was good. They talked for 3 hours. It did not feel like 3 hours. She told him about her mother, not as a disclosure. It came out sideways the way it always did, through something else. He had asked why she had stayed in the same building for 4 years when her record indicated she could have gone anywhere. She gave the professional answer first, and then, because he was watching her with that attention that made professional answers feel insufficient, she gave the real one. "She was a patient there," Mary said. 3 times, and then she wasn't anymore. She turned the cup in her hands. "I was 17. I sat in the waiting room on the 2nd floor for 6 hours, and a doctor I never saw before or after told me she was gone, and then walked away." She paused. "I decided I would never be the person who walked away." William was quiet for a long moment, holding the thing she had said with appropriate weight. "Do you still go to that waiting room?" he asked. The question was so precise that she looked at him sharply. "Why would you ask that?" "Because people who build their purpose around a place of grief sometimes need to go back, to make sure it still means something." Mary looked at him across the coffee table in the winter light. "Yes," she said, "sometimes." He nodded, like that was the right answer, like he was glad she'd told him the truth. "What about you?" she said. He looked at the window. "My father built the first Ashford hospital," he said. "Not Chicago General, a clinic in rural Ohio that didn't have one. He did it because his brother died from something preventable. Appendix. No hospital within 40 miles. He turned the cup in his hands, the same gesture she'd made, and she wondered if he noticed. He spent the rest of his life building hospitals, acquiring them, protecting them. "And you inherited that." "I inherited the obligation," he said, "and I decided to make it a mission, not because I'm good, because I understand what it costs when a building like that doesn't exist." She held his gaze. "He would have liked you," William said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, unguarded, not planned. He believed a hospital is only as good as the people who refuse to stop caring about it when it becomes inconvenient. The music school below them had started. A piano, scales, patient and repetitive. The sound came up through the floor like a heartbeat. "That's why you went in person," Mary said. "You could have sent lawyers." "Because my father would have gone himself," he said. "Because some obligations you have to stand in front of." She looked at him, at the man who had spent 11 days in a hospital bed because he believed in the thing his father had built, not the asset, the idea. "William," she said quietly, "why did you really leave without saying goodbye?" He looked at her, really looked at her. "Because saying goodbye to you face to face would have required me to say something I wasn't ready to say," he said. "What would you have said?" He was quiet for a moment, then careful, like placing something fragile in someone else's hands. "That 11 days in a room where someone treated me like a person, not a problem, not a name, was more than I've had in a long time, and that I didn't want it to end. And I didn't know what to do with that." Mary held that. "You could have just said that," she said softly. "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm told I overcomplicate things." "Who told you that?" "You did," he said. 11 days ago, you said that's not honesty, that's architecture." She laughed. She remembered saying it day 3 when he had answered a question about his pain, with something technically true that communicated nothing accurate. "I didn't think you were listening," she said. "I was always listening," he said. "That's the thing, I was always listening." The piano reached the end of a scale and started again, a step higher. The coffee had gone warm. Outside, Chicago moved through its Sunday, unhurried, grey-skied, full. Mary set her cup down. "Tell me something true," she said. "Something you haven't told anyone else." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of moment you know you will remember the texture of. "I've been in this apartment 3 times in 2 years," he said. "I keep it because it was my father's. Not the prestigious address, not the penthouse the board expects. This one. The books are his. The kitchen table is his. The tape on that spine," he glanced at the shelf, "is his handwriting." Mary looked at Middlemarch with its worn cover and 4 readings. "You come here when you need to remember something," she said. "Yes." "What?" "That I'm a person," he said, "not just a name." She looked at him, at William Ashford in a grey sweater in his dead father's apartment, with a cup of coffee he hadn't prepared for her because he didn't yet know her well enough to assume. "You are," she said, "you are a person." He looked at her with something open in his eyes, that brief, unmistakable relief. It was there again, deeper now, like something returning from a long distance. They stayed another hour. Small things, the neighborhood, the piano below, a book she'd read that he hadn't, her residency choices, Ohio in winter. They did not discuss what this was, because the question had already answered itself in the space between them without requiring language. When she stood to go, he walked her to the door. They stood in the doorway, the same position as the opening, and the symmetry of it was not lost on either of them. "Sunday," she said. He understood immediately. "Yes." "Same time?" "I'll have coffee ready," he said. "Black, 1 sugar." She smiled. The full version, the one she didn't manage or moderate, and his face receiving it went completely still. Not the controlled stillness she knew, a different kind. The stillness of a man who has just seen something he wants to hold perfectly in place so he can keep it. She went down the stairs. She did not look back, but she heard the door stay open until she reached the street, heard it without turning, and she carried that all the way home. 3 months later, room 7 was empty again. Scheduled empty. A planned maintenance gap between patients, 24 hours of just a room. Mary knew this because she knew the 3rd floor's rotation the way she knew her own breathing. She had not thought about the timing until she was standing in front of the door at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday and realized she had walked there without deciding to. She stood in the doorway. The chair was still angled. Housekeeping had never corrected it. She had never corrected it. Over 3 months it had become a fixed point, an unchanged thing in a floor that changed constantly. Patients arriving and leaving, charts filling and emptying, the whole perpetual motion of people in need and people providing care. The chair held its angle. Mary walked in and sat down. The room in empty was different from the room occupied, quieter in a way that wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of space. She could hear the floor outside, the distant rolling of a cart, a conversation too far away to make out words, the ambient rhythm of a hospital at night. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the bed. She had not told anyone exactly what the past 3 months had been. She hadn't needed to. Dana had figured it out from the way Mary's phone lit up on days off, from the Sundays, from the particular quality of Mary's expression when she returned from those Sundays. Dana had said nothing, which was its own form of approval. The Sundays had become the fixed point of her week. Not because of what they were still in many ways ordinary. Coffee, the piano below, books discussed, hours passed in the ease of two people who had given up the need to perform for each other. But ordinary had never felt like this. Ordinary, Mary had learned, was not a lesser category. It was the rarest and most valuable one. She thought about the first Sunday, about "I'll have coffee ready, black, 1 sugar," and how he had remembered every detail of every small thing she had ever said in room 7, catalogued and kept. That precision directed toward her, toward knowing her, toward the deliberate, careful project of understanding a person. She thought about 3 weeks ago, arriving to find him at the kitchen table with papers spread across it, still working. She had said, "I thought this was your day off." He had looked up and said, without drama, "You're the only place I've found in a long time that actually feels like off." She had sat down across from him and not said anything. She had not needed to. She was still sitting in the chair when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the nursing staff footsteps she had learned to identify like a language, something different, measured, purposeful. She knew those footsteps too. William appeared in the doorway of room 7, still in his work clothes, the dark jacket, the tie loosened but not removed, the day visible in the slight tiredness around his eyes. He had come directly from somewhere. He held his phone in one hand and looked at her sitting in the chair beside the empty bed, and something passed through his face, the expression he made when a thing exceeded what he had expected. "How did you—" she started. "Janet called me," he said. "Apparently I'm in the contact sheet now." A brief pause. "She said there was someone sitting in room 7 who appeared to be communing with the furniture." Mary laughed, that short, involuntary sound that he alone seemed to produce in her. "I was not communing." "No." He leaned against the door frame. "What were you doing?" She looked at the empty bed, at the room where he had spent 11 days being Mr. 7, and she had spent 11 nights becoming someone slightly different from who she'd been before. "Thinking," she said. "About?" She looked at him in the doorway, in the dim nighttime light, in his loosened tie and the day on his face, leaning against the frame like a man who had stopped pretending there were places he didn't want to be. "About how strange it is," she said, "that the most important thing that ever happened to me started in a room where I didn't even know who I was taking care of." He came into the room, unhurried, the way he always moved through spaces, like someone who knew the destination was certain enough that speed was unnecessary. He pulled the small visitor's stool from beside the bed and sat down across from her, close enough that the space between them was the space of two people who had decided it didn't need to be larger. "The important thing," he said. "You know what I mean. I want to hear you say it." She looked at him, at the face she had memorized in dim light and morning light and Sunday light, and now this, the blue-tinged night of a room where monitors used to hum, and where a man named William Ashford had spent 11 days letting her believe she knew exactly where the power in the room resided. "You," she said. "I mean you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the small space between their chairs and his hand, the right one, the knuckles that had told their own story, turned upward, open, not reaching for her, just open, an offering that required her to choose. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the waiting room on the 2nd floor, where she had been 17 and grief-struck, and decided she would never be the person who walked away. She thought about 4 years of the same corridors, the same purpose, the brilliant ordinary exhaustion of caring for people who needed it. She thought about an envelope in a parking garage and a chair left angled and black coffee with 1 sugar and Middlemarch, with its taped spine, and the way being truly known, by someone paying real attention, felt like something she had been living without long enough that she hadn't realized it was missing. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. Warm, certain. The grip of a man who did not do things halfway. They sat in room 7 in the dark, the room where it had started, 11 days and 3 months and 1 whole rearrangement of her understanding of herself ago, and the floor outside continued its eternal motion, and the city pressed its lights against every window, and the chair stayed angled the way it had always been angled toward him. "What happens now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness she had spent 4 months watching him build toward her, imperfect, considered, real. "Whatever you want," he said, "at whatever pace you want, with whatever you need from me that I'm capable of giving." A pause. "I'm not easy, Mary. I know that." "Neither am I," she said. "I know." That not quite smile. "That's the part I'm not afraid of." She looked at their joined hands in the dark room. "One condition," she said. "Name it. You are never allowed to pull my schedule again." A beat. Then, with absolute sincerity, "I cannot promise that." She laughed, and he laughed. The first time she had heard him laugh fully, without restraint. Low and warm, filling the room the way the monitor's rhythm used to fill it. Steady, present, entirely alive. She did not let go of his hand. 3 weeks later, she came into work and found a small framed thing on her locker. A single printed page, simple frame. Internal Compliance Investigation. Chicago General Hospital Final Report. Evidence of fraudulent activity confirmed. Primary report submitted by Mary J. Calloway, RN 3rd floor. Status formally credited. Investigation record. She stood in front of her locker for a long time. She thought about submitting that report the first time, the second time, the silence after both, the particular loneliness of doing the right thing into what felt like a void. And she thought about a man who had received it on the 3rd transmission and decided, because of it, to come in person. She put 2 fingers against the glass of the frame gently, the way you touch something you want to remember. Then she put on her badge and went out onto the floor. Room 7 had a new patient that evening, an elderly woman named Constance, who had strong opinions about the room's chair placement and asked Mary to move it back against the wall. Mary moved it. She smiled the whole time. And later, much later, at 3 a.m. at the window at the end of the corridor, she looked out at Chicago holding its lights against the winter dark, and her phone was in her hand, and she was thinking about Sunday. She typed 4 days. The response came in under a minute. "I know, I'm counting." She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the city. She had come into this corridor 4 years ago carrying grief and turning it into purpose. She had built something real inside these walls, something that mattered, that had a name now in a formal record, that had changed the shape of the building she had given her young adulthood to. And she had found, in a room marked with the number 7, in the darkness of a night shift in the middle of an ordinary week, something she had not been looking for and could not now imagine having missed. She turned from the window. She went back to work. And the night, as it always did, as it always would, opened itself forward into everything that came next. She went into that room as a nurse doing her job. She came out as a woman who had been truly seen, maybe for the first time. And he went in as a man who owned everything. He came out understanding what it meant to belong somewhere. Room 7 is empty now. But what it started, that has no end. If this story moved you, drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you know what it feels like to be seen by someone when you least expected it, this one was for you. Subscribe. We have more stories coming.
You lay there with a borrowed name, like you were hiding from the world again. I spoke to silence like I always do, to strangers passing slowly through. But something in the way you breathe felt like the night was watching too. You never told me who you were, just eyes that held a storm inside. And every word we didn't say was something neither one could hide. In room number 7, where the lights were low, you were just a stranger, no one had to know. But somewhere between the silence and the truth, a heart that owned everything began to belong to you. And I was just a nurse, doing what I do. But somehow in that quiet room, you saw me too. secrets moving through the dark, like shadows learning not to hide. You listen like nobody does, like every word had weight and blood. And suddenly the walls we built were thinner than they ever were. You said my name like something rare, like it was worth remembering. And in that room of borrowed time, you gave the silence everything. In room number 7, where the monitors glow, you were just a patient no one had to know. But somewhere between the truth and what we hide, a man who owned the world finally let someone inside. And I was just a nurse doing what I knew. But somehow in that quiet room, you saw me too. You left without a goodbye, just a letter and a line, a number written carefully, like hope between the lines. And months later in that hallway, when the room was empty still, the chair was turned toward where you'd been, like it remembered you at will. In room number 7, where it all began, two strangers in the darkness, learning who they were again. And somewhere between the night and morning light, a story that was never planned started that night. You own the whole hospital, the city and the sky, but the only thing you ever wanted was the reason I stayed by. And I was just a nurse doing what I do, but somewhere in that quiet room I found you.